Hello, everyone. I see everybody connecting, joining. I'm starting to see pictures coming up. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And we just have a little slide, just a little brain teaser as we get going. If you're interested, we just have a little question there about how would you fill in the blank? If it was blank water, how would you fill it in? And if you're so inclined, you could type in your answer into the Zoom chat, and just would be interested to see how people are thinking about how they would answer that question. As just a little brain teaser as we wait for people to arrive. And we're just gonna wait a couple of minutes and just to make sure that we have everybody here before we get started. But welcoming you all and your friendly faces from all across our land. I see lots of I always, when I do these things, I always feel like the lady from Romper Room. I see Gabby and Amber and Mark and Paula. A lot of you will be too young to get that reference, but you can go YouTube it. That's great. And the one ground rule that I'm going to establish for the Zoom call is please nobody do room rater. That's we're all joining from our homes, I'm sure. But I do have my Coal River sign up, so I feel somewhat in the zone for the call.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it feels very weird being at home, but making it work.
Yeah, it sure does. So again, if anybody's just joining us, welcome, bienvenue. We have a little brain teaser question here on the PowerPoint, and just if you we're interested in filling in that blank, how would you answer that question? Blank water, and if you are so inclined, you can put your answer in the chat to share with other people. I saw this on Twitter. Meredith Brown from Ottawa Riverkeeper had posted this on her Twitter, and I was like, oh, that's kind of an interesting question. How would you answer it? So I figure since we're all freshwater professionals, healthy water. Thanks, Kathy. Ooh, Scott, I like that. It's all about, you got that. Nice. Ooh, excellent, Steve. Life-giving, I love it. I'm just going to give maybe just another 1 or 2 minutes for everybody to, so that we can just give maybe 1 more minute. It's like 4 minutes after, and I'm always 5 minutes late to the party. So I'll give somebody the benefit of the doubt. Got water. I love that, Warren. That's awesome. That's great. Fantastic. My very best friend is a person who's always late. In fact, at my wedding, which I got married at home, 5 minutes into the wedding ceremony, you can hear the doorbell ringing because she was 5 minutes late to the wedding. And but she's recently been elected the mayor of my city, and she's figured out that they have to wait for her now that she's the mayor. So but
Fashionably late.
That's right. She's doing a good job getting there on time. Fast flowing water like in the wide rivers. Oh, I love that, Cass. That's great. Excellent. All right. Well, I think I'm going to get started with just a few introductory words, and then I'm going to introduce our first speaker, and we'll get going. So hello, everyone. My name is Molly Dema, and I'm joining you today from unceded Wolastoqey territory in Fredericton, New Brunswick, that is in Canada on the East Coast, along the banks of the beautiful Wolastoq St. John River. And we are Canada's 38th designated Canadian Heritage River, and very, very proud to be so. So I wanted to just say that behind the scenes today is Leah Adamshute, and Leah can wave, and she's running all of the tech side of things. So thank you so much, Leah. And we also have Mark and Ashley from Parks Canada as well, who work on the Canadian Heritage Rivers program. So thanks to you two for being here as well. And a huge welcome and thank you to all of you for spending this time together with us today at this Freshwater Learning Session from the Canadian Heritage Rivers program. The Canadian Heritage Rivers Program is Canada's national river conservation program that since 1984 has worked really hard to designate, manage, and work to conserve Canada's outstanding river resources, as well as raising awareness about the importance and value of rivers to Canada and Canadians. To date, 40 rivers have been designated. The Canadian Heritage Rivers Program has recently adopted a new strategic plan to help guide us for the next 10 years. And the priority is to support you, the people who are involved and engaged in this program and who have been for a really long time as river managers and on our boards. And so we're really excited to provide some opportunities to help us better connect, learn, share, and shout from the rooftops how awesome our rivers are. So this session is one of many that we hope will provide a learning opportunity for you all and an opportunity to discuss interesting topics that impact us, those of us who are working in the world of freshwater management. And we have three great speakers today who are going to talk to us about some very interesting, timely, and impactful subjects. And a huge thank you to all three of them for being here today. So just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. As with all other video calls, the practice is to keep yourself muted unless you are speaking in order to reduce the background noise. And there's about 30 of us here today, which is so amazing. But so we really do need to keep the noise down to a dull roar so we can hear and everybody can enjoy our amazing, amazing speakers. And secondly, if you have any questions along the way, you can just type them into the chat box and the speakers can either address them as they go along in their talks, or they can address them at the end, and it's up to each speaker. I haven't asked that question of them, but we can just kind of do that off the as we go along. So that's great. So again, a huge thank you. I'm so looking forward to us spending some time together today, and I'm very pleased to move along to introduce our first speaker. So Michaela Martial graduated from the University of Alberta with a Bachelor of Science in Animal Health and switched to the environmental NGO field, beginning with animal care internship with Wild North Wildlife Rescue and Rehabilitation Center. She moved on to the Nature Conservancy of Canada, where she worked in communications and engagement. And she currently works for the Canadian Council on Invasive Species and is an outreach liaison, where her focus is working with partners to educate citizens on steps they can take to stop the spread of both terrestrial and aquatic invasive species across Canada. And Michaela and I were just talking about how relevant this is to river managers, particularly increasing the knowledge about aquatic invasive species, the role that invasive species play in one of the big ticket items that we as freshwater managers deal with, which is biodiversity loss. So I really, really hope that you can sit back and enjoy the talk that Michaela is going to bring to us about the Canadian Council on Invasive Species and their Clean Drain Dry program. Thank you so much, Michaela. The floor is yours.
Awesome. Okay. So my name is Michaela Martial, and thank you so much for the opportunity to present here today. I'm coming from Edmonton, Alberta, which I'd like to acknowledge is Treaty 6 territory. And as I was introduced, I'm the outreach liaison for the Canadian Council on Invasive Species. And I'm here to tell you about our Clean Drain Dry program and how it relates to preserving the integrity of Canadian waters. Next slide, please. So first, a little bit on us. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to preventing the spread of invasive species across Canada. We act as a national voice and hub to protect Canada from the impacts of invasive species. We have 11 provincial and territorial chapters, and we collaborate with other partners to deliver pathway-focused tools and resources that stimulate Canadians to take action against invasive species. Next. So our focus is pathways preventing species introduction and movement that will reduce impacts and save costs for everyone. Our pathways include horticultural, aquatic, and terrestrial recreation, aquarium trade, forestry, etc. We link and connect groups across the country, improving coordination, reducing duplication, and facilitating the sharing of information. The resources we create are national and bilingual and are to be shared and used by all partners with a stake in invasive species. Next slide, please. So invasive species are not a problem localized to any area or industry. They are a national issue that affects all Canadians. That's why we have a diverse network of directors, as listed on this slide, and without their support, we could not accomplish our goal of eradicating invasive species. So we have everywhere from government to Indigenous groups, horticultural, other nonprofits, just a very good, strong, diverse group on our board. Next slide. So then we also have provincial and territorial chapters, which are individual species councils with a core mandate of helping reduce the spread and impacts of invasive species in their jurisdiction. Our goal is to build a strong national inclusive voice that supports and links a range of provincial and territorial invasive species organizations from coast to coast. Another goal is to have one chapter recognized in each province, territory, and region, and we have 11 official chapters, so we're almost covered all of Canada. So next, please. So most people aren't aware, but invasive species are one of the leading causes of decline of native species, including plants, fish, insects, and other animals. Further, most people aren't aware that humans are the main reason invasive species have spread so fast. We were just discussing biodiversity before, and this is where this really comes into play versus a lot of people discuss climate change, but invasive species are also a huge leading cause. A common example is zebra and quagga mussels. When they're young, they can't be seen with the naked eye. When they spread, they wreak havoc on any area they establish in. Some issues they cause include covering beaches with sharp shells, clogging drinking water and hydro infrastructure, covering boats, and outcompeting native mussels for resources. Eradicating them is very difficult, so the best way to protect our ecosystem is by preventing their establishment. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is what I'd like to talk to you guys about today is Clean, Drain, Dry. The Clean, Drain, Dry campaign is a call to action that empowers recreational users of aquatic resources to help stop the spread of harmful aquatic invasive species through changes in behavior. Some of the promoted actions include understanding and identifying aquatic invasive species, cleaning, draining, and drying watercrafts and other gear, reporting sightings, and informing others of the threat of invasive species. Now, this really comes into play for you guys because of all of the recreational use of rivers and people traveling between rivers. And as these invasives spread, like it's just so hard to eradicate them. So prevention of establishment in your river is just best way to protect it. So please, next slide, please. So Clean, Drain, Dry was a pilot project in BC. We got funding from the Fisheries and Ocean Canada's program as to go for a national pilot that, as I said, encourages boaters, aquatic recreation fishers to use their critical role in protecting local watersheds from invasive species. So this pilot was focused on creating an online hub for Clean, Drain, Dry information. And this project was successfully wrapped up earlier this year. We've created resources from the project, including signage, posters, etc., for our partners to use and implement in the future. Next slide, please. So Clean, Drain, Dry has been a huge success for us. We've partnered with dozens of partners across Canada, installing signs, distributing educational material. And while it was initially launched in BC as a pilot program, CDD has since been implemented across all of Canada. In New Brunswick, they've put in approximately 75 Clean, Drain, Dry boat signs in launches, and they have about 27 different partners and groups installing signs. Nova Scotia has about 5 or 10 partners putting up signs, and this is all just a start to our national expansion, and there will definitely be more to come. Next, please. So for our current resources, all resources are available for download on our website. We have both bilingual and English resources. And recently we released a Clean, Drain, Dry coloring book, which is designed to teach youth about invasive species. It's currently available in English and French, will be coming out soon. Next slide. Okay, so this is our partnership program. We have different levels of partnership. We have first our support level. The goal of the support level is to encourage individuals to personally adopt a behavior change program. Supporters are individuals who pledge to adopt Clean, Drain, Dry. They serve as role models and encourage other people to join. Levels 1 and 2 are more relevant to you. They are meant for organizations looking to implement Clean, Drain, Dry in their region. The main difference between the two levels is that level 2 gets 2 free hours of graphic design services from us. So our partner levels help support and grow Clean, Drain, Dry. The coordination of the program, coordination of resources, development partners, and adding logos to the website outreach are all part of our partner program. So if they're implementing at a national level, we work with them. And if they're implementing individually in a provincial level, we connect them to our provincial chapters for kind of like an easier, smoother implementation. Next slide. So Clean, Drain, Dry is an important initiative to protect Canada's waterways. The more organization partners we have join us, the stronger our protection network becomes, because the main way to prevent the spread is prevention. Once these species are established, they are so hard to manage. They're very expensive to manage. So the more awareness we have about just making sure to clean your boats, dry your boats, drain them before moving between waterways is very important, especially because it is human activity that causes the biggest issue. And so I hope through this presentation, you'll all consider uniting with us and add Clean, Drain, Dry to your management practices and help prevent invasive species from damaging our heritage rivers. And next. Any questions? Let's see, find the chat. Is there any questions on the, oh, here's the chat. Okay, I don't see any questions on the chat. So if anyone wants to jump in and ask.
I'll just say, Michaela, as the river manager for the St. John River, we've participated in this program, and the St. John River Society that I work with, we work with over 30 watershed groups that are along our river, because we have a long river, not as long as Steve's on the Fraser, but still 673 kilometers. So we partnered with local watershed groups that work regionally to help put up the signs and identify the best sites for the signs, you know, marinas and local boat launches. And it was a really excellent way to create and strengthen partnerships with local watershed groups and and they're often the people who are really involved in the doing and habitat restoration. So it really did work quite well, especially when you have just really logistical questions like, I work at a desk and I wouldn't know where to start to get a pole and pound it into the ground, and I don't even own a screwdriver to put the sign on, right? So it was a really excellent partnership that made it easy to implement the program. And we've had a lot of really good feedback from boaters and people just feeling. And the other thing that we really did was worked with a lot of fishing tournaments, especially ones where boats were coming in from out of province. So I live in New Brunswick, and we have some fishing tournaments where people come in from Ontario. And so we've even done as much as working with the provincial government to have checkpoints set up at the border to check boats, or just to provide some information for people to ensure that they're following the Clean, Drain, Dry protocols and reducing the spread of these invasive species. So it's been a real success story for us, and it's been easy to do. It hasn't been kind of outside of our scope of management or a real drain on staff. It's been a wonderful partnership strengthening opportunity within our watershed, and I would really encourage everybody to see how it could fit in with the work that you're doing, because it's been really beneficial.
Yeah, for sure. Like, most people want to help. Most people aren't actively trying to spread invasives. And if you just tell them, hey, this is an issue, but here is a very simple 3-step initiative. Drain your boat, clean it, and dry it before you move on. It's something everyone can do, and they're just quite happy to do it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we've had the same great response from like individual boaters who've spoken to our partners. It's been very successful. The public has been very responsive of it.
I see that Scott Parker has a question, and I see that Gabby answered it. But Scott, I'm just curious if you could tell us where you're from. You said that you wanted to confirm if your agency is involved, and I was just wondering where you're from.
Yeah, no, I'm with Parks Canada in Ontario.
Awesome, that's great. Thank you.
I will just jump in here, Scott, just now that I know what organization you're from. We've just renewed a partnership with Parks Canada. So anyone on the call who is with Parks Canada, I'll put my email in the chat, but you can reach out because we do have a special kind of agreement with Parks Canada to implement Clean, DrainDry, but also a couple other of our programs. So yeah, you can email me for more information on that. But yeah, great to hear interest anyway. Thanks.
Thank you.
Now I see there's a question from Kathy. Are there any special tools to clean the boat or just a towel? There's various different options. You can like scrub off the part of the boat that was in the water is a good way to do it. If you just spray it off with clean water, like being careful to make sure you're not doing that by new body of water. And just letting it dry out is a big thing. A lot of these aquatic species, they can't handle being dried out. So yeah, just a combination of like a brush, spray it down, dry it off, just very simple steps. Like there's no particular way to do it. Just drying is, I think, one of the very most important steps.
That's great. And I see that Gabby in the chat. Thank you, Gabby, for providing that contact information so that if anybody thinks of anything, then they can reach out to Gabby or Michaela at the Canadian Council for Invasive Species. Any more questions? Either on the chat or you can just speak up. It's totally fine. Going once, going twice. Okie doke. Well, thank you so much, Michaela, and to Gabby. That was so informative, and we really, really appreciate the time that you took to be with us today. So thank you so much. That was great.
Yeah, you're so welcome. We're happy to have the opportunity to join you guys.
Perfect.
Have a awesome presentation. I'm just going to lurk in the background now.
Yeah, sounds really good. So I wanted to just let you all know, I've been trying to break up my like administrative talk in between presentations, but I just wanted to let you all know that the Canadian Heritage Rivers Program is a partnership between the federal government, the provincial governments, and the territorial governments. And we have a board of directors that provides guidance to us and is our decision-making body. And we also have a few committees, and all of those are populated with people from all across the country, our federal, our provincial and territorial partners. And I just want to take this opportunity to say thank you to them. We thank you for your partnership, and together is better. Now, before we move on to Julie to talk to our next presenter, you know, Zoom is a weird land. And what I'm hoping that you guys can do is I'm hoping that just for a second, everybody can turn their cameras on and I can take a picture of the screen, and that will be like our group shot for the meeting. And everybody can wave and we can have our group shot for the meeting. And I'll take it with my camera on my phone. And like, man, if this isn't 2021, I don't know what is. This is like peak 2021. Leah, is there any way that you can like minimize your screen so that the pictures get bigger, and if not, then that's okay. Don't worry about it if it's going to be a problem.
How's that, Molly?
Yeah, that's great. I'm just going to give everybody a couple of seconds to turn their cameras on so that we can Get everybody in there. And see all the beautiful.
Molly, you said that right when I was taking a big bite of a bagel and cream cheese because I didn't have time for my lunch today. But I had to make sure I didn't have cream cheese all over my face.
That's right. Oh my gosh, hilarious. I love it. All right. There's Warren representing 2021 better than anybody else in the meeting with the mask on. I love it. That's awesome. Okay, well, that's great. Okay, so I'm going to hold this up and everybody on 3 will say rivers. 1, 2, 3, rivers. And can everybody wave? Yay. Awesome. Thank you so much. That's terrific. Okay, now you can all go back to sleep again. Okay, Julie, are you ready?
I am.
Awesome.
I am ready. I was
Okay.
born ready.
You were born ready. I love it.
Oh, and by the way, Molly, you know, you could have just done like a control print screen or like a snippet instead of taking a picture with your camera, and the resolution would have probably been better.
Oh, right. You know, my husband is an engineer and he told me that I should do that, but you know, I'll remember for next time. I'll remember for our next learning session, but thank you for that. I'm such a Luddite, like it's not even funny, but okay. So our next speaker is it Julie or Julie?
It's Julie.
Julie, okay. Our next speaker is Julie Boucher from Environment and Climate Change Canada. And Julie is here to talk to us about the Indigenous Guardians Pilot Program, which I'm very excited to learn more about. So Julie has worked with Environment and Climate Change Canada on and off since 2009. So she's experienced and knows what's going on with things. And as a director of conservation partnership, she has helped Environment and Climate Change Canada meet their conservation targets and reconciliation objectives. I love it. Julie has managed Canada's hosting of World Environment Day in 2017, accompanied ministers on climate change on international missions, launched and managed the Indigenous Guardians Pilot, and established 3 distinct Indigenous governance bodies to co-design, co-develop, and co-deliver the pilot. She was most recently awarded the Canadian Wildlife Service Assistant Deputy Minister's Special Commendation for Leadership for 2019-2020, and has worked in a number of departments, including Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs. Oh my gosh, Judy, I'm so excited to give you the floor and learn more about all this amazing work and how it impacts our rivers. Thank you so much. Merci.
You're welcome. It feels awful just hearing myself, my bio being read like that. I'm thinking, is that really me? So
You are amazing.
Well, thank you. Do I gather that you'll be sharing the presentation, or should I try to share mine?
I know Leah would say it's totally up to you. So if you want Leah to share it, she can. And if you want to try to screen share, you go ahead.
I'm not very, and like I told you that tip about the print screen, but I'm so not, sort of technologically inclined that if she wanted to do it, that would be wonderful.
Okay.
And
We'll
in the
say-
meantime,
Yeah. Okay.
in the meantime, I can start just by saying, as you said, my name is Julie and I'm the Director of Conservation Partnerships, and I'm super happy to have been given the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm lucky enough that I'm coming to you from the unceded territory of the Algonquins of Golden Lake. And I'm so happy and feel privileged to call this my home and to be allowed to thrive on this territory. So I'm very passionate about Guardians. It's definitely not the only thing I do. My portfolio includes Indigenous protected and conserved areas, the National Steering Committee to Pathway to Target 1, which I co-chair with British Columbia. I also manage, for those of you who may know the initiatives, the Ecological Gifts Program, which is a program that allows donors to give out their land to either land trusts or municipalities for them to be conserved in perpetuity, and also manage the Natural Heritage Conservation Program, which funds lands trust in order for them to purchase land to be conserved in perpetuity. So, so that's kind of in a nutshell, my portfolio. But of course, my baby and the one I'm most passionate about, given my Ojibwe ancestry, is Indigenous Guardians.
Should you do any free time? You sound like the busiest person in the world.
So I just today for this session, I was quadruple booked in my agenda and had to kind of go, okay, I promised I would make this presentation and had to say no to my DG for 2 different meetings this
Oh
afternoon.
my gosh. Well, we're very grateful. I'm trying to buy a little bit of time because Leah hasn't put up that presentation yet, and I hope she's not having too many struggles with finding it. Oh, there we
Well,
go.
there we go.
Perfect. Ask
Sorry
and you
about
shall
that.
receive. There we go.
Thank you so much. So let's just go to the second slide right away. So for those of you who are not aware of the Guardians pilot or have not heard about Guardians yet, hopefully not a lot of you, the Guardians came about after a budget 2017 announcement where the government announced 25 million to pilot over 5 years funding Indigenous Guardians initiatives across Canada. Now, the idea for the announcement didn't just was the government who decided. The Indigenous Leadership Initiative, ILI, which is an Indigenous organization that mostly represents First Nations across Canada, who specializes in land use planning and forest management, were the ones who lobbied the federal government, explaining and sort of putting emphasis on the fact that funding Guardians is beneficial not only for the individuals and communities involved, but the local environments as well as the sort of regional environments, provincial departments, territorial departments, and the federal government as well. So they lobbied the federal government, and in 2017, the federal government said, okay, let's do it. So one of the things we did originally is that we wanted to ensure that we'd get some boots on the ground. So we worked through an early process, but the goal and the heart of the Guardians pilot was to establish co-governance with our Indigenous partners. And we're doing this on a distinction-based approach. We're working sort of individually with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And we have governance bodies, and they have representatives that are non-political on these governance bodies. These are experts that have put in place Guardians initiatives in the past and have managed them. And they make all the decisions when it comes to priority setting, criteria establishment, recommending proposals, reviewing proposals, and even recommendations for evaluation. The idea in the end is that we want the pilot to build a business case that we can go back to government with to show the return on investment of funding Guardians, and hopefully in the long term, secure some permanent funding for Guardians to be administered by an Indigenous body, because Indigenous Guardians are Indigenous led and should be Indigenous managed. One of the great news is that as part of budget 2021, additional funding was announced in the amount of 100 million to continue to support Indigenous Guardians until 25-26, which is wonderful, which provides us even more time to build that business case for permanent funding. Slide 2, please. So for those of you who are not familiar with the term, what are Indigenous Guardians? Well, I'm going to give you a definition, but really the federal government is definitely not an expert. Indigenous Guardians are defined by Indigenous groups, which is why we work sort of separately through Inuit, Métis, and First Nations, because they have a slight little difference on what represents an Indigenous Guardians. But generally speaking, we're talking about Indigenous groups being the ears and the eyes on the ground on their traditional territory, taking care of their land, water, and ice, and building these community-based stewardship initiatives that support their communities, that allow for elder and youth relationships and knowledge transfer, that support their leadership and decision making, and allow for better land use, that sort of have an aspect of cultural and language preservation, as well as build sort of sustainability for communities, building meaningful jobs for Indigenous youth in the future, and bringing them back to the land, which is what they were always meant to do. So Indigenous Guardians is not a new concept. There are the BC Watchmen that have been sort of officially formalized for the past, 4 or 5 decades. The Innu Guardians have been on the land and recognized for at least 30 years. So the concept of Indigenous Guardians is definitely not new. The formalization of it and the federal government sort of recognizing Indigenous guardianship as a legitimate sort of employment that not only benefits the communities, but they are on the ground doing some of the work that we should be doing, is fairly recent. This is fairly new. Some of the activities that Indigenous Guardians do are listed here, like habitat management and conservation work. They do restoration and data collection and monitoring and, sort of wildlife monitoring, fish monitoring. There's this great group in British Columbia, the Gitmiao, who sent us a video of them like doing their field work and using drones to monitor fish spawning, or salmon spawning and going up the rivers. And anyways, so there's really, really cool stuff that Indigenous groups are doing, sort of protecting and monitoring their territory. So next slide. So the objectives of the pilot, as I mentioned before, objective number 1, to support existing and new Guardians initiatives. The idea is that we knew there was a lot of Guardians initiatives out there, but there wasn't a lot of information on them. So in 2019, we did a call out, and for each of the Indigenous groups, a little bit differently for each, because they selected different ways to deliver their funding. And so we did a call out, and we received a lot of applications with groups developing Indigenous Guardians initiatives for elements as diverse as climate change monitoring to archaeological resource restoration, for example. So Indigenous Guardians is not just about a strict sort of nature focus, and which is why I remind people all the time that the pilot sits within Environment Climate Change Canada, and nature conservation is one of what I call the best indirect outcomes. But really, one of the goals of the pilot is to support Guardians initiatives and to start building that capacity within Indigenous groups to continue to be stewards of their lands. As I mentioned, we're evaluating the pilot right now, because remember, it was initially going to sunset on March 31st, 2022. So we're in the evaluation phase now of the first tranche of funding. And our goal will be that the evaluation will support a business case for long-term funding. And as part of this long-term funding, our goal is to establish Indigenous Guardians networks that would take sort of upon themselves to administer the funding completely without the presence of the federal government, which is kind of what we're looking for. We want them to take charge and to ensure that Guardians remain Indigenous-led. The next slide, please. So as I mentioned, one of the first things we did was to get some boots on the ground in 2018-19. And so we funded a few proposals outside of our co-governance process, just because we didn't want that funding to be lapsed and that the program started a little bit late. And in that year, we funded about 28 initiatives. 24 of those were First Nations. There were 3 Inuit, I believe, and 1 Métis. And we funded them for $5.7 million and got great results from that early round of funding. Next slide. The rest of the pilot is sort of the what I call the meat. Concurrently, while we were funding early proposals, we established the governance that I'm talking to you about. So we established 3 different governance models. For the First Nations, the model includes First Nation members who are specialists, if you will, when it comes to guardianship. And we have 4 federal representatives, and we all sit together and all the decisions are made there. And for example, the First Nations decided to do a call out and a very competitive process, dividing their funding into different tiers, sort of initiatives that were just starting out, Guardians initiatives that were well established and could use ongoing funding, and networks of Guardians initiatives, because what we were starting to see is that different Guardians communities, different Indigenous communities are getting together in regions and are creating networks of Guardians across to cover their overlapping lands, which is awesome. The Inuit Guardians Committee is a committee that is chaired by both Environment Climate Change Canada and Inuit Tapiri Kanatami. And there are 4 members as part of that committee, and the 4 members represent the 4 Inuit regions. And together we meet monthly and make all of the decisions similar to the way we do with the First Nations. The Inuit opted a little bit differently for a competitive process, but they selected projects to be funded throughout the 3 years instead of funding new proposals, let's say, for example, for just 1 year. And then we work through the Métis National Council's National Environmental Working Group. And that's a working group that includes their 5 governing members. And they selected to not compete the funding and instead to fund their governing members in accordance with MNC's regular formula. And for them, our approach was different. Instead of having people approach us with their Guardians proposal, we worked with the governing members to develop Guardians proposals. So that was an interesting sort of different approach. Next slide. So the pilot also has internal governmental and external governance. So for example, in order to be able to share best practices and to try to coordinate as best as we can, we have both a Director General and a Managers Interdepartmental Committee, because some of you may or not be aware, there are other sources of funding throughout the federal government that fund Guardians-like activities like CERNAC's Community-Based Climate Monitoring Program. And so the idea is that we want to continue to coordinate ourselves within the federal family to ensure that we're sort of heading in the same direction and try to make funding for Indigenous folks as easy as possible to apply to and streamline it as much as we can. As well, though the provincial and territorial involvement or engagement in Guardians is quite minimal, and this is at the request of our Indigenous partners, we still, at any opportunity we can, provide some presentations and updates to federal and provincial and territorial either directors or managers committees that are involved with either conservation or parks or wildlife. And we do this to ensure that they can play a part as we move forward on Guardians and up to date on the progress of where the pilot is heading. We also have sort of internal governance, which we have a secretariat that supports the 3 governing bodies, and as well the secretariat acts sort of as internal information source for anybody who would have information regarding Guardians and that they would like to either receive that or get involved. Next slide, please. So by the way, I didn't mention it at the beginning, but please feel free, folks, at any time to either, I can't see hands, but maybe they'll be flagged to me, or put questions in the chat. I have it open, and I'm more than happy to sort of be interrupted and answer questions as we go. I should be able to remember where I am, so please feel free to jump in at any time. So to talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts. So each Indigenous group was responsible for making their own decisions, as I said. The First Nations opted for a competitive process, and out of that competitive process, they selected over the 3 years over 30 initiatives that what they would call tier 1. So initiatives that are just starting out and need some seed money to, to sort of get started, to get the community engagement and the leadership support, and maybe, establishing some community meetings in order to be able to publicize their vision. Or even start with, a few students over the summer, a few Indigenous students over the summer doing some Guardians work with some elders. Like, there's all kinds of models. But that represented over 3 years about 1.8 million. Then 7 communities were selected as First Nation programs, Indigenous Guardians initiatives, if you will, that were established but could use 3 years of funding. And those were funded for about 2.9 million. And then 5 networks of Guardians initiatives were selected over the 3 years as well for 2.9 million each. Now, the lovely thing about the new funding that was announced out of budget 2021 is that the amounts are almost tripled, I believe, or quadrupled. We had 25 million for 4 years, and now we're getting 100 million for 5. So that means that instead of having 150 proposals to assess and be able to fund 10 proposals, we're going to be in a way better position in the coming year to be able to fund a lot more Guardians initiatives. So that really it makes us happy, because one of the things we've realized over the 3 years is that very seldom have I reviewed proposals where I was feeling, should we fund that? Are they ready? Maybe out of 125 to 150 applications we receive yearly, maybe 3 or 4 out of those I would not have funded, but the rest I would have gladly funded. So having more funding really will make a difference in the pilot's competitiveness, if you will, and as well in being able to make a difference on the ground. So as well as part of the Guardians, one of the things we do is we We support the hosting of opportunities for Indigenous Guardians to come together and to share best practices and to share their stories and narratives. And so we held a first gathering in Vancouver, British Columbia in 2019, where there was about, 350 Indigenous participants. And it was a great opportunity for youth involved in the pilot to talk about their experiences and how this has changed their lives. Anyways, it was a really sort of life-changing, life-altering session. And there was an additional gathering that was online this year that happened in June, I believe, June 4th to 6th, and it was online, but it was very successful. And the participation even grew from our 340 original. So very excited about that. I see a question in the chat. Julie, do you have any sense of the overall demand out there? Is it well beyond the 100 million that is available? Yes, it's well beyond the 100 million available, because if you break down the 100 million over 5 years, that's what, sorry, I'm lousy in math, but about 20 million a year. And our application process usually represented about 150 applications for a total around 50 to 52 million a year. So we're still short of the demand, I think. But I think we're working towards the demand, and just establishing sort of the contribution agreements and getting folks in that process will require some time. So by having this 100 million increase, if you will, incrementally until 2026, will allow us to be able to increase the number of proposals being supported each year, as well as supporting them for subsequent years. And we're hoping that by 2026, we will potentially be supporting between 300 and 400 Indigenous Guardians initiatives. Fingers crossed, which is what we're hoping. Hopefully that answers the question. Next slide, please. So for the Inuit, as I mentioned, they selected, they did a competitive process with an expression of interest first, and then a proposal stage, and they selected out of a total of 15 proposals, 6 proposals to be funded over the 3 years for about 4.43 million in funding. And 3 of those proposals were in Nunavut, and the rest were one each for each of the 3 other regions. So the Nuvialuit, the Nunavik, and I have a blank, I apologize. So hopefully nobody's from that region right now listening, but the other Inuit region, the Inuit Nunangat region, I can't remember for the life of me. Next slide, please. So for the Métis, as I mentioned, they decided a non-competitive way to proceed. They funded their 5 governing members for 3.4 million. And which is wonderful, because they're still yielding great results, which provides us sort of a very good comparison as part of our building of our evaluation in order to determine just how beneficial Guardians proposals on the ground can be for communities and individuals involved. As well, last year, we held an online, again, because of the COVID restrictions, IPCA and Métis Guardians virtual gathering. And it was held in January, and over, I think at a certain point, 65 participants were involved, as well as a few federal departments and non-governmental organization. And it was 2 days filled with a lot of opportunities for Métis Guardians and Métis involved in Indigenous protected and conserved areas to talk about their experiences and some of their successes, but as well some of the challenges they face in moving forward that will help us move forward to be able to ensure that Indigenous Guardians, becomes fully Indigenous led and is funded permanently. I see there's another question, I believe, as the program is competitive, do you have any specifications such as geographic regions or types of projects that support specific federal government objectives? Haha, great question. But in total honesty, from the beginning of the pilot, given that the instructions I had been given was that this was to be co-delivered and this had to be Indigenous led, we have not concentrated on supporting federal objectives. I mean, it does indirectly. The Guardians funding supports, sort of nature conservation, species at risk restoration. It supports so many aspects of government priorities, but we didn't put emphasis on selecting proposals because, for example, they supported an Environment or Climate Change Canada objective. Actually, to a certain extent, I even turned back the deputy minister who asked me, "Oh, Julie, keep some Guardians funding for caribou." And I said, "No, I'm not going to keep funding for caribou unless my joint working group governance body decides they want to target caribou with the funding. But it's not my decision. This is Indigenous led, and therefore they're making the decision. And if they want to direct funding towards a specific priority, that's their choice." And I stuck to my guns to the detriment of sometimes my own sort of career, but that's fine. I'm rogue and I'm at the end of my career, so I'm not afraid of career limiting moves. All this to say, we were provided funding from another organization. So the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada last year approached us and said, "We have some capacity funding for Indigenous folks that we did not have an opportunity to set up a program for." And they came to us late in the year and they said, "You think this funding could be sort of delivered through the Indigenous Guardians governance?" And I said, "Well, let me check, but it may mean that you may have to kind of go sort of, and you're putting the decision in the Indigenous governance body's sort of hands. And so you can't come back and say, no, we don't want to fund that proposal. They recommend the proposals to be selected." So we did that. We brought it to the joint working group. They agreed, and they selected, I believe, 10 proposals to be funded with Impact Assessment Agency funding. And, they're super smart folks. They selected Guardians proposal that we're working with either a project proponent on minimizing the impacts of an environmental assessment or monitoring following the implementation of an industry or a mine or a project of some sort. And so they selected those Guardians proposals that had a link to and a need for impact assessments. So it was very positive. But generally speaking, when it comes to the Guardians, it is Indigenous led, and therefore we don't provide that kind of direction to where the funding is going to go. The Indigenous groups are, which is, I think, wonderful. Next slide, please. I'm looking at my time. I'm trying to make this quick. I'm usually better at that sort of talking quickly. But sort of, we're getting close to the end. Some of the next step, as I mentioned already, the evaluation of the pilot. So the evaluation has multiple phases. The first phase was just to establish the strategy for the evaluation and how we would proceed. The second phase is to evaluate on a distinction-based approach the Métis, the First Nation, and the Inuit proposals, and sort of start pulling out the return on investment on multiple aspects. For example, the economic return on investment, but also social return on investment within communities. And some of the things that we're starting to see through the evaluation is that in communities where they have an active Guardians initiative that's in place and that's hiring, sort of youth working on the land, is that they've seen reduced amounts of family abuse, reduced amounts of dependence on narcotics, alcohol, so less substance abuse. Anyways, a lot of these things that we wouldn't necessarily think of by just putting a program in place that's built to build capacity and that indirectly protects nature. But some of the things that we're seeing. Then the last phase of the evaluation will be to take the 3 distinction-based project evaluation and do an overall evaluation of the pilot, including its delivery through the distinction-based approach and its governing bodies and the different governing structures that we establish, in the goal of coming back and being able to use that information to support the business case for long-term funding for Guardians. I think that's it. Next slide, please. There we go. So for additional information on the Guardians pilot, we have there a generic email box, which the team is really, really good at trying to answer all of your questions. And we also have a website at canada.ca Indigenous Guardians, and you can visit there. And so that provides you all of the information on the federal pilot. But we, again, are not necessarily the experts when it comes to guardianship. So I invite all of you, if you're interested in Indigenous Guardians, to seek out 2 resources. The first one is Nature United. Nature United is a non-governmental organization that actually hires Indigenous folks to help Indigenous groups start their Indigenous Guardians initiative. And they have a great toolkit, and they also have social media. And the number one sort of information when it comes to guardianship to me is this lovely beauty right here. So for those of you who can read that, it says Land Needs Guardians. And I believe you can find the website at landneedsguardians.ca. And they also have a Facebook page. These pages are led by the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, which is our main partner when it comes to developing the Guardians Pilot. And so they have great stories and base a lot of their information on the Australian Rangers Guardians model, and just, you know, an enormous fountain of information there available for all of you who might be interested in Guardians. So I think that's it. Molly, are there any questions other than the ones I tried to answer in the chat as we were going along?
Well, that's just great. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat or just shout it out or use your hand reaction. Happy to take any questions any way they come.
Sounds good.
While we're waiting, I'll say merci. Thank you, Julie. What an interesting and impactful project that you work on that is so meaningful to our rivers and the people who live along them. I'm so jealous of the work that you get to do. It must be so interesting, and you must feel such a sense of pride to be able to play a role in a fair, responsive, equal governance of our resources in this country. And it's very, very meaningful. And we all thank you very much for the hard work you're doing. And it's so lovely to hear about other partners that you have, other groups that share those priorities, and the help that you have in being able to lift this program up and make it accessible to people. So
well, thank you so much, Molly.
Yeah.
I always tell folks that I have the best portfolio in the federal government, which I don't care what other people say, but I still think I do. And you'll see potentially from the next presentation that there are tons of links, and we're trying to make even more for Indigenous Guardians and this third-party delivery mechanism. We're looking towards the future for them to be leaders when it comes to nature conservation and to play that role they've always played through other funding sources as well. For example, through, you know, potentially administering Canada Water Agency funding, potentially maybe for the future, or the 2 billion trees from NRCan in the future. So anyways, a lot of stuff coming. So I think you'll be hearing a lot more about Guardians as we move along.
Yeah, it's a great delivery vehicle, right? For all of these programs and priorities that we all share. Yeah, it is.
Hi, Julie, it's Mark Johnson here. I've got first of all, thanks again for your presentation. It was great. Another question for you. And I don't know if you have a sense of this or not, amongst the range of projects that, that you've been able to fund, how much of that work is being done like within IPCAs or towards the establishment of IPCAs? And how much of that is being done on like within federal, provincial, and territorial parks or conservation areas? Like, do you have a sense of on the landscape, what types of lands are the Guardians programs active on?
So that's a very good question, and it differs greatly depending on the distinct Indigenous group, right? Because, for example, Inuit have land claim agreements. So most of their work is on their own lands or Crown lands. When it comes to Métis, they're at the other spectrum. There's only one Métis group in Canada that sort of is attached to land and has a recognized land base as part of their settlement and agreement with Canada, and that's the Métis General Council of Alberta. So and when it comes for the First Nation, is a mixture. So some of it is done, you know, within sort of treaty territories. Some of it is done on traditional lands. Some of it is done in national parks. Some of it is done in provincial parks. We try, whenever there's proposals that come in that are being done in either, you know, sort of national parks, provincial parks, we connect to Parks Canada, though they sit on our joint working group, so they have a constant say. They have their own Guardians funding and program as well, but theirs is not Indigenous led. It's mostly to help bolster guardianship within national parks. So it's administered a bit differently, and which is why we sort of include it, but it, you know, it's kind of apart from this Guardians initiative. And when it comes to IPCAs, it's different because out of, for example, the over 86 Guardians initiatives that have been funded over the past 3 years, only 3 or 4 of those were related to an Indigenous protected or conserved areas. So I try to clarify for people that Indigenous protected and conserved areas always have a Guardians component, always. Because as part of the establishment of that IPCA, you need sort of long-term management. But the majority of the Guardians initiatives we're funding across Canada are not related at all to IPCAs and are just Indigenous groups exercising their traditional responsibilities to the lands and their stewardship responsibilities to their traditional lands across Canada in all kinds of territories. And I have to say, generally speaking, they're very well welcomed. Like even provinces and territories have approached me and saying, oh, we want to get involved. We understand we have an Indigenous group in Yukon that's really interested, or in Manitoba that's really interested, and we'd like to also support. And to date, just because this is Indigenous led, and I think Indigenous groups have wanted to make sure that they're well started on the spectrum before bringing in all the partners. But overall, I think it's a Guardians tend to be seen as supporting PTs with their sort of provincial and territorial responsibilities that are shared with the federal government when it comes to environment and nature. So does that answer your question, Mark?
Absolutely, yes. Thank you very much, in a very comprehensive way and very interesting. I'm surprised to see how little of it relates to IPCAs, and I'm fascinating.
So I think it's because IPCAs as well is fairly young, right? So we just received through the Enhanced Nature Legacy and Budget 21 announcement, new funding for IPCAs, and that's going to start next year. So I think there's about 166 million over 5 years available for Indigenous groups wanting to establish Indigenous conserved and protected areas in whichever vehicle mechanism they're going to use, because you know IPCAs can be established through like federal or provincial legislation or agreements or Indigenous law. You know, there's all kinds of overlapping ways to establish IPCAs. So I'm going to bet that there'll be way more connections between Guardians initiatives and IPCAs as we move forward. But to date, it's Guardians on its own without IPCAs is really a movement that is garnering support across Canada. IPCAs are just starting out, and there's links there, but I think they just need to be strengthened even more.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Julie. We really appreciate all the information. My gosh, it was so informative. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I hope that people take advantage of reaching out to Julie, to thinking about how an Indigenous Guardians program might apply on your river, how you can partner with other watershed groups. You know, at the Canadian Heritage Rivers program, we have our river managers, and then we have stewardship groups that we hope that those river managers partner with along their river. So the opportunity to strengthen those ties through perhaps participating in the pilot program for the Indigenous Guardians program, I hope is something that you will consider along your river. So thank you again so much, Judy. We really, really, really appreciate it. Thank you. Merci.
My pleasure.
Okay. Well, how's everybody doing? Little finger shake. And we're going to move on to our very last speaker of the day. And our last speaker is David Leach. Hello. And David is here to give us an update on the development of the Canada Water Agency. David is the Acting Director of Water Policy for the Canada Water Agency at Environment and Climate Change Canada, and potentially the only job I'm jealous of. And so I want to say, David, a huge thank you, merci, for taking the time to be with us today. And the floor is yours.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much. It's nice to be in a job that people are jealous of. That's not always the case. I would be jealous myself if I wasn't in the position. Yes, I'm here to give you a bit of an update on where we're at in the process around the Canada Water Agency. I wanted to begin today by acknowledging that I am speaking to you from shared Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe territories. in what is known as Jones Falls, Ontario, which is somewhere between Smiths Falls and Kingston. For those of you who know the area at all, I'm staring out the window at Whitefish Lake, which is part of the Rideau Canal system. And I feel very fortunate to have that as my foreground every day when I wake up. I live here on and off with a bunch of kids, but with my partner, Karen, who's an Indigenous midwife and a registered midwife. And why do I share this where I am and who I am? It's because as I am certain for many of you, the quality and quantity of fresh water and how it's managed and who is managing it in Canada is a deeply personal issue. And I have a deeply personal commitment to seeing through the obligation and the responsibility that I've been given to help create a Canada Water Agency. So I feel very honored to have the role that I do, having come from 10 years, well, over 10 years working at Fisheries and Oceans in Indigenous fisheries. This was a really nice opportunity for me to work on a very important area for not only the Government of Canada, but for all Canadians. So honored to be in this position. I want to thank you for the invitation to be here today to sort of give you a snapshot of how we've gotten to where we are now and maybe some of the signposts of where we're going to. I want to acknowledge too that my colleague, Laura Cervoni, who is the manager of water policy within my Canada Water Agency team, is here with me today as well. So I told her that she could virtually kick me under the table if I got off track. I don't even know how to do that, but anyway. So as all of you are in the water world, I will call it the water space, you know, we all know about how much water Canada has, being, you know, home to a fifth of the world's freshwater resources. And Canadians consistently rank water as the most important resource to them and to the country. And we know it's integral to Canada's identity and culture, essential to human health and sanitation and well-being of ecosystems. And we also know that freshwater issues affect Inuit, First Nations, and Métis communities in different ways, but know that it plays a central role in their well-being and cultural practices. The lakes and rivers across Canada obviously support fisheries, forestry, agriculture, energy, manufacturing, recreation, tourism, shipping, navigation, and the list goes on. And in the Great Lakes region alone, it's estimated that nearly 30% of American and Canadian workforces rely on water in the Great Lakes area as a source of their livelihood and their living. So, and 1 in 4 Canadians draw their drinking water directly from the Great Lakes. These are numbers that, you know, I mean, there are so many statistics around the importance of water, and it just constantly reminds us of the importance of the, anyway, for me, of the work that I'm doing in the freshwater space. And it probably will come as no surprise that we are looking at, I mean, we look at water from a number of different perspectives, but increasingly the issue of climate change and climate adaptation is one that is in the forefront of our minds when we think about water quality and quantity issues. We know that it's one of the greatest challenges that we are facing today. Its impacts are already being felt through droughts and floods, deteriorating water quality, all in part contributed to by climate change. And Canadians are seeing those costly impacts firsthand in their communities, and they're seeing it in the news across the country. So the stress on freshwater resources from climate change impacts, from population growth, from increased use of water and changes in land use have been significant over the past 30 years. So this includes when Canada experienced the first coast-to-coast drought on record in 2001 and 2, the worst drought to hit Western Canada in more than 100 years. And it's estimated that agricultural production dropped by $3.6 billion. GDP was negatively impacted by $5.8 billion, and more than 41,000 jobs were lost. When we saw the flooding in 2013 in Alberta and the Greater Toronto area, we know that there was in excess of $3.4 billion of insured damages resulting from this flooding. And additionally, in 2017 and 2019, flooding along the Ottawa River forced evacuations in Eastern Ontario and Western Quebec, and the military was deployed to help with flood relief efforts. And in this recent summer that is, I would say, almost past, because it still feels an awful lot like September or summer, even though it's November, the prairies experienced severe drought conditions, and precipitation was one of the lowest on record. So it's evident around us the impacts of climate change on water. And the water quantity issues are just one piece of the puzzle. The water quality issues and the impacts of climate change on toxic and nuisance algae, for example, is an issue facing many freshwater bodies nationwide. It's estimated, for example, that algae in Lake Erie alone cost the Canadian economy an estimated $270 million a year. Huge economic dimensions to what we know is already a climate and environmental issue. So we're intensely aware of the fact that we have a huge duty and responsibility to protect Canada's fresh water and preserve it with care for generations to come. And we know that Canadians and their governments have successfully addressed a wide range of freshwater challenges. And those challenges differ from region to region because of our enormous size and varied geography. And we were given in 2019 two parallel commitments. The first one, through mandate letters, was a commitment to further protections and taking active steps to clean up the Great Lakes and Lake Winnipeg, Lake Simcoe, and other large lakes. And secondly, in the previous government, the government of Canada committed to creating a Canada Water Agency in its last speech from the throne. Driven by those two mandate commitments, over the past 18 months, we've been working hard to do the legwork, do the research, engage with Canadians and Indigenous peoples in Canada to determine where the gaps are in freshwater issues and freshwater management, and to develop a proposal for how we can best address that, both through both of these commitments that I spoke about. We identified over, I think, 20 lines of inquiry looking at freshwater challenges and opportunities in Canada, and led three parallel streams of engagement, one with Canadians writ large, including citizens and organizations and NGOs, one with provinces and territories, and the third with Indigenous peoples in Canada. You may have seen in June of this past year that we published a What We Heard report, and that was based on engagement with Canadians over the fall of 2020 and winter of 21. And these open consultations, which were based on a discussion paper, also were supplemented with national forum and 6 regional forums to engage directly with experts Indigenous peoples, stakeholders, and the public. We heard some pretty clear messages, and I don't think any of these will come as a surprise, but I think it's important to underline them. What did Canadians tell us that they think we need as a country and in terms of the federal government's role? We need federal policies and policy foresight analysis to promote effective management and protection of freshwater resources and ecosystems in Canada for the 21st century and beyond. And this includes how we adapt to climate change. And we need better coordination amongst the 20+ odd federal agencies and departments implicated in water management and programming. We need to have available to decision makers the critical data and information that they require to make decisions based on, in part on the foresight analysis, but based on the data that we're collecting and that citizens collect and organizations collect and academics collect. And the ability to make this data available to decision makers is key. We heard very clearly that Canadians want to be actively engaged in managing and protecting freshwater. We heard that strong relationships and partnerships with Indigenous peoples are required so that they can play an increased role in managing Canada's freshwater. And we heard very clearly that we need to have applied cutting-edge science to tackle freshwater challenges of the next century, again, including climate change. So we heard those in our conversations with Canadians, and we also heard similar priorities stated by provinces and territories, each of which submitted detailed comments on the discussion paper, and we had bilateral conversations with our provincial and territorial colleagues in 2 separate rounds over the last year. We also, as I indicated, had created a separate engagement with Inuit, First Nations, and Métis nations and organizations on freshwater priorities and the development and operationalization of the Canada Water Agency and the role that Indigenous peoples in Canada might play in the Canada Water Agency. So here we are now immediately following a federal election, which I would say put pause to some of the work that we were doing as we were in the caretaker period. But with the announcement of our new minister, the Honorable Stephen Guilbeault, on October 26th, we are, once again lining ourselves up for the next steps in our work. And we're continuing our discussions and relationship building with our Indigenous partners, knowing full well that that work will carry on now and after we create the agency. There will need to be continued engagement with Indigenous peoples and with Canadians as well on the agency and how it's operationalized in the future. We are waiting, and we're in that wonderfully awkward period where we're waiting for mandate letters and a new speech from the throne to confirm some of the indications we saw in party platforms. We think that the signposts are all pointing in the right direction, but we certainly need those key pieces to confirm the direction that we're headed in. And in the meantime, we know that Canadians and Indigenous peoples in Canada have told us very clearly that they're concerned about the accelerating impact of climate change on freshwater. And we are very cognizant of the fact that the responses to those challenges must be regional in nature due to the differences in water and water bodies across the country. We have heard loud and clear that the recognition of strong linkages between freshwater and biodiversity and the important work that we have to do in connecting with other government departments, like fisheries and oceans, for example, around aquatic system health and wetlands. And we have heard very clearly that the agency must or should have elements to it or dimensions to it that include enhanced governance and coordination across the federal government, the cutting edge science that I referred to, the critical data for decision makers, and that we need to continue our work to advance reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. I think, you know, that what I have seen is, again, that the signposts indicated we're headed in the right direction. We still have a lot of work to do. We need the policy, budget, and spending authorities before we can actually get to the launch date of a Canada Water Agency. But again, I think we're headed in the right direction. We've done an awful lot of work. We've engaged with Canadians and with Indigenous peoples in Canada, and we've heard from our stakeholders very clearly what they think the priority should be for a Canada Water Agency. And we're working hard to get through the policy, budget, and spending authority stages so that we can launch a Canada Water Agency in the coming, well, I'll say the coming year. I mean, if you look at the Liberal Party platform, it said the Canada Water Agency would be created in 2022. Again, we're still waiting for our mandate commitments and mandate letter commitments and the speech from the throne to confirm the direction and time frames for some of the work that we're doing. But I'm optimistic that we've done a lot of the homework that needs to be done to set us off on the right foot or the right feet. And I think, you know, we will start incrementally, and we will build a solid foundation for an agency that can grow over time and take on the challenges and be flexible to meet the challenges of an evolving climate and its impacts on water. So I know that it's a bit of a light update, but that's kind of where we are at in our work right now. And I do look forward to coming back in the future to give you a more substantial update on the progress that we've made once we've gotten through all of the next steps in our work. So I'm happy to take on any questions that I can answer, and turn the floor back over to you, Molly.
Thank you so much. Well, I did pop a question in the chat box for you there while other people are thinking about their questions for you. Without seeing anybody raising their hands, maybe we can start with my question and give people a chance. So I just, I was wondering about these data warehousing systems and the Atlantic Water Network being, you know, sort of quite advanced here on the East Coast. And I see the benefit and the role they play in providing, you know, data warehousing for water quality data that watershed groups and Indigenous groups are collecting. And they've that information has traditionally been, you know, very dispersed, kept internally, not shared, siloed. Sometimes it gets sent to a provincial government. Most times the provincial government doesn't do anything with it, and nothing's moving up the ladder to provide aggregated, collated data to make policy decisions with, right? And so the Atlantic Water Network, I know through the Gordon Foundation, has provided a really good platform for us to start engaging and making collaborative decisions here on the East Coast. As I mentioned, I'm very aware that it's being sort of, you know, adapted and replicated for BC, the Prairies, and I recently saw the announcement for the Great Lakes, and just curious about how the water agency is intending to partner, support, continue. Is there a role in the way that you guys are imagining the Canada Water Agency for that service, which I think for those of us who are river managers or provincial or territorial administrators of fresh water seems like a really important part of the puzzle?
Absolutely. Yeah, there has to be, and I mean, I am not a data specialist, but I know that it's not a lack of data that is affecting us. It's the lack of the ability to access that data when we need it. And sometimes that's because the data that's being collected is not, like one data set's not compatible with another, just from a pure, information technology perspective. And sometimes also, we need to do a better job at making sure that the data that is being collected is the data that we need to make decisions. So I think there is a we're working on there will be a strong aspect, I think, to the work that we do as a part of the agency that supports doing a better job at making sure that those data sets talk to each other and, more importantly, are available. How that exactly plays out, I think there's still work yet to be done to figure that out. And I think that's what I was sort of getting at a little bit too with it, starting small and building. So much of the work that we need to do is depending on others and our ability to constantly be in conversation with others. And that's not true just on the Indigenous relationship side of things, but is equally important on the science and data and the governance aspects. So we can't do this alone. And we will need to make those connections to existing initiatives to try and leverage them to accomplish some of those goals that we're hoping to accomplish. But certainly data availability for decision makers is a hugely important factor in the work that we're doing.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Any other questions? I just wanted to.
Sorry, it's Kathy from Upper Town. Just to comment that, further to your comment, Molly, in Ontario, conservation authorities are a great model for data sharing, data coalition, and watershed management on a watershed scale. And so I'm hoping that the lessons learned here in Southern Ontario will be shared across Canada where possible through the Water Agency. So I'm very excited to hear it coming. And I'm also concerned that every time a government changes, programs get axed, data gets interrupted. So any comments about longevity of the agency?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I don't have a clear answer on that. I know that, we're trying to think strategically about how we can make the agency a permanent fixture, but we recognize as well that we will always be at the behest of parliamentary appropriations to ensure that there's funding there to support the agency. I think, it's very clear whether and as a policymaker, because that's my background, as a policymaker, you can look at obviously look at water in many, many different ways. It is obviously there are the environmental, there's the ecosystem considerations, there aquatic system health, wetlands health, but there's also the whole economic aspects of it. So I think that independent of the government of the day, there's a substantial amount of evidence pointing towards the need for a permanent role for the government of Canada in terms of water in a Canada Water Agency. Whether that is something that we can accomplish remains to be seen, but I certainly think the weight of evidence points towards the need for that. I'm hopeful that I'm hopeful, given my last 20 years of experience in the federal government, that that we can build the momentum and create the critical mass by launching this properly, that will see it sustained in the future.
Great, thank you for that great question, Kathy. Any other questions? I guess I have another one just following up on what Kathy was saying and about trying to create just some little toeholds to, make it just start to grab on and make it a little bit more permanent. Do you, I saw something flying around last week about a request to ask the government to create a parliamentary secretary position. And that might, again, from a governance perspective within the government of Canada, highlight the importance and value of the water agency. Is that, I don't know, like, I don't know what the question I'm asking. Is there an update on that? Do you think it's a good thing? Do you think it would help move things along?
I think that, well, I don't have anything specifically to say about that, but I will say that I think we're trying to do the best job we can to create the profile for the agency that will give it the position it needs to have in order to have influence across the federal government system, but also more broadly internationally, because obviously we have connections internationally and across the Canadian governmental landscape, if you will. And we're looking at a whole range of options in terms of where the agency sits and who it reports to, and what profile of that person or that position, I guess, would have. So we haven't, again, that's part of sort of the policy direction that we need from our political leaders in terms of how they want to position it. I think it's very clearly in their minds. It was in their platform, so it's nice to see that. And they seem to be willing to put some substantial investment into setting us off on the right foot, which I also take as a good sign. But again, we're beholden to the speech from the throne and the mandate letter, so we'll know better, hopefully in a couple of weeks, what that direction is. And it may, because those things can be very specific, it may say, it may direct us to create something that reports to a particular position. I don't know yet. We'll have to see.
Great. Thank you very much. Any other questions for David? Going once? Going twice? Awesome. Well, thank you, David, for the update on the program that has so much relevance to the Canadian Heritage Rivers program. We really appreciate it. We're excited to see this initiative moving forward. And I think I speak on all of us as partners in the Canadian Heritage Rivers program when we say that we are keen to stay engaged and know how we can continue to help, as rivers form a pretty big part of freshwater in Canada.
Yes, they do. And thank you very much. And thank you for the invite. And, if anybody wants to reach out to me individually, always welcome to do that. Happy to chat.
Awesome. Well, that's it for today, folks. On behalf of our board of directors for the Canadian Heritage Rivers program, I really want to say thank you. Merci. Wooly one for spending time with us today and spending time together. And I hope we can all do it again really soon. And from my home along the Willistic River, I wish you all wellness, joy, and please continue to stay safe. Thanks, everybody, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Thank you.